Hello everyone, welcome to my review of Sophstar, a brand new indie shmup by Brazilian studio Banana Bytes, and I believe looking at their website that this is their first shmup. At least I'm not seeing anything else listed on their website or social media. And what's really cool about this game is that it is continuing the trend of excellent arcade-style indie games coming out of South America, where a few years ago we had Fight and Rage from Uruguay, and now we have Sophstar from Brazil. So I do think it is worthwhile to keep an eye on this region of the world when it comes to excellent arcade-style indie games. I'm really excited what we're going to see moving into the future. And so a quick overview of Sophstar, because I was sent this review code basically out of the blue. Shoutouts to Shmups VR for hooking me up with it, but I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. So if I were to describe this game in a nutshell, I would say that it is a refreshed take on the Toaplan style of shmupping, where it isn't exactly full-on cave-style Danmaku bullet hell, but it definitely has a lot still going on screen, and there are elements of bullet hell stuff in it, like you have a slow button and everything like that. But at the same time, that slow button is more of a convenience rather than a concentrated shot like you'll see in Toho and Cave. So it's this really interesting middle ground between a Batsu gun and a Dodonpachi, and I really liked it. It also has a lot of fresh ideas and fresh takes that are its own, that are very unique to it. So I wouldn't say that it is a full-on throwback game or anything like that. It has its own identity, it has its own things going on. And so I do think it's absolutely worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of Toaplan style games like Batsugun or maybe Truxton, somewhere in there. Maybe between a Batsugun and a Truxton would be sort of the range that it lands on. So visually, I really like the presentation of the game. I think the sprite art is very well done, colorful, it stands out, not a lot of reused assets or anything like that. There's a lot of content on offer here. It's a long game. I think 7 stages, 8 if you count the final boss and the TLB. So there's a lot to get through, and they didn't repeat too many assets. They didn't have too many reused sprites, which I really do appreciate, especially for an indie game. And so I think visually the game really stands out among its peers. And also the explosion effects were nice and juicy. The flash effects when you hit things really worked well. And just a lot of detail on the smaller amounts of animation where it doesn't seem all that important, but it really goes towards making an indie game stand out among its peers, because usually that's the area where indie games struggle, isn't necessarily the base presentation, but all the little details, the explosions, the damage, what the bullets do, how the bullets look, all those types of things. And I think Sophstar does a very good job visually making sure that it has a lot of richness to the detail. So I think the visuals are solid, not 100% perfect, of course. I think there still could have been more work on the death explosions, maybe beef those up still a little bit more. They're pretty beefy, but you could beef them up a little bit more. They could have maybe gone in like Cave and added in more damage animations to enemies. But still, very good job on the pixels and the presentation. I'm going to talk about the soundtrack because I keep forgetting to talk about soundtracks in shmups, but I do like this game's soundtrack quite a bit. If I were to criticize it, I would say the biggest problem with the soundtrack is some of those earlier tracks like stage 1 and 2 seem to lack a little bit of bass, where the later tracks in the soundtrack, basically stage 3 onward, they've got a nice, juicy, thick bass line. They sound excellent. Again, South American arcade games, maybe it's just me, they seem to bring the heat when it comes to their soundtracks. So I do like this soundtrack a lot. I love the instrumentation. I just think that the bass on some of those early tracks could have been beefed up. And also just in the mixing of the game, I actually went into the audio options and turned the sound effects down to about 70%. Because I think the OST is a little bit too buried under the sound effects, at least for my personal taste. So I actually recommend going there and beefing up the mix when it comes to the music. Sound effects wise, I'm still sort of figuring out how I want to comment on shmup sound effects. Though I will say that this game did do some cool stuff with its sound effects that actually inspired me a little bit. Because I noticed when you're using your main shot, you get this very nice, low, subtle sound effect on the main shot sound. But when you hit enemies, you actually get a different sound effect that is louder in the mix. And I thought about that and I was like, that's maybe something I should do in House of Bullets actually, where I have a nice low sound effect on the shot. And then when it hits things, you get maybe like a nice slicing, loud damage sound effect. I really like that, and it actually was really helpful gameplay wise at times, because this is a game like many Toaplan style shmups where the screen is very chaotic, things are going on, you're always 1 second away from death, and it comes from places you never quite expect. And so being able to sort of rely on that sound cue to know, okay, I'm hitting it without having to glance up, it can actually come in handy quite a bit gameplay wise. So I thought that was an excellent touch when it came to these sound effects. Now let's talk about the interface and features of the game. And this is something that seems like a little bit of details, but when you look at indie games, especially, extra effort into the features and interface really make your game stand out and really give it a nice, slick, professional, polished feel to it. And this is something that Sophstar very much excels in. The menus are excellently designed. You can also go into the video options, and they have a bunch of really fun visual filters you can put over the game, kind of like Cave did with their 360 ports. And some of them are really excellent. Reminds me a bit of Zero Ranger. Again, it's not a big deal whether or not they do this, but having nice touches like this really make the game feel really fleshed out and polished, and just add more variety. For this video, I'm just using the standard visual filter, but there's actually a lot of fun ones you can go through and check out. And then there's all the different game modes. In this review, I am not going to cover all the different game modes because I don't really feel like doing that, and you know, the review gets a little bit bloated when I try and do that, but there's a ton of really excellent game modes. The ones that, of course, are very important to pay attention to is that it has an online leaderboard. Unfortunately, I don't believe the online leaderboard has replays, but it has one. And what's really cool is I ended up getting second on the intermediate with my ship. Nice built-in feature I think all shmups should have moving forwards. They have a special endless mode. They have a score attack mode. They have like an ultimate mode or something like that. And then you go into the arcade mode, and the arcade mode has a very well done training mode. Not perfect, but very well done, where you have a stage select, thank you. Then you also have a boss select within the training mode, something I think more shmups need to do, because a lot of the time you need to practice the last boss or the last few bosses, and you don't want to replay the entire stage to do that. Though I do wish they had a midpoint checkpoint, because the stages are pretty long, and there are times where you just want to practice the back half of the stage. So if they're thinking about doing some updates, I think adding in a midpoint checkpoint would be really useful. Still, the training mode definitely came in handy for me when it came to getting my 1cc/TLB clear, so I think they did an excellent job there. Again, they're just putting in all these types of features that really make the game stand out and make it accessible for newer players. And I do think this is a great shmup for people who are newer to the genre. Might be a bit brutal in some areas, though speaking of features, they have a really nice difficulty select. I've decided for these reviews what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the default difficulty, because it gets a little bit complicated when you try and review a shmup and you say, oh, here's a problem here, but maybe that problem's a little bit different in the higher difficulties or anything like that. But I've decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the default difficulty, whatever the game puts me on by default that the developers obviously feel is the most universal difficulty. That is the difficulty that I will be covering in the review. So I played the intermediate difficulty, and it's very nice. Definitely arcade equivalent, maybe a little bit kinder to an arcade Toaplan, but not easy by any means, not a walk in the park. It took me about 4 or 5 hours of practice to get the 1cc TLB clear. And that's pretty typical for most arcade modes when I play them, and I thought the balancing and level design of the difficulty was very well done. This is going to be comfortable to newer players in the genre, because the game definitely gives you this really nice linear difficulty curve. It's not as steep and spiky as what you get with cave shmups, for example. You are slowly ramping it up. Though I will say, personally speaking, I do wish when it came to the overall level design and game design, because the game is about 30 minutes long, I do wish they sort of chopped down stage 1 and stage 2 just a little bit. They're well done. There's not anything that stands out as bad or anything, but I think they go on just a tiny bit too long, because what happens is when you start grinding out runs and grinding out high scores and everything, you start to sort of roll your eyes when you have to play stage 1 and stage 2. They get a little bit redundant after a while. So I do wish they kind of chop those down just by a little bit, by maybe take a minute or so of gameplay out of them. Though there is still a lot of fun to be had with them when it comes to the scoring, and we'll talk about that later on when we get to the scoring and everything. But the overall difficulty and level design of the game, I think, was very solid, very well thought through, very polished. Even though this is a first shmup from the studio, It feels like they really know what they're doing when it comes to putting this thing together. So now let's talk about the ships and sort of basic survival gameplay. So there are a ton of different ships you can play in the game. I really like the ship select screen, not only because of the cool graphics on the right side of the screen, but also because it gives you a little bit of an overview, not only stats, but also sort of written notes on what the ship is good at, what the ship is bad at, how it struggles, so you don't have to kind of guess at it. I really like that. I think more shmups should try and do this, actually give you kind of a rundown character summary of the different ship types. That being said, the default ship is by far my favorite ship, and probably will be the only ship type that I will play because it is beautiful, it is perfect, and I love it. And so I'm going to talk a lot about the default ship, but there's lots of cool other ships you can go through and explore. So what's cool about the default ship is there's actually a lot of clever ideas going on here that I haven't really seen done before. The main one being is the way the shot works. So the way it works is that this ship is very point blank happy. This ship wants to point blank things. And when it comes to shmup design, there's always been sort of different ideas on how to communicate this is a good idea to players, whether you add in an aura like in Dodonpachi, or you have a really nice shot limit that gets louder and more visceral like you get in Ketsui, or in Ketsui you lock onto things faster when you point blank. But in this game, what's really cool is that the visual design of its shot tells you point blanking is good, even without even understanding the concept of point blanking. This game is communicating to you via the way the shot looks that point blanking is a good idea, because the way it works is it comes out of your gun full sized, massive. It's like this huge beam, and then it gets narrower at the end. And so when you're playing, visually you can tell when you have the giant blast landing on top of things, oh, I'm point blanking, it's working. It has that really clear visual indicator that I think is beautiful, because when you're trying to point blank things and speed kill things, which becomes important for scoring, rather than trying to have to sort of figure out based on locking noises or based on how fast your shot sounds or whatever, now you can actually visually tell, because the way the beam looks when it hits, you can say, oh, I'm hitting it with the full beam, so I'm point blanking. Really, really liked that a lot. The ship movement speed is also excellent. It's quick. I noticed in the stats for the ship, it kind of mentioned that the ship speed was a bit of a negative in the developer's mind, because it might be a little bit difficult to control. But when it comes to Toaplan style shmups, older school style shmups, where you do a lot of macro dodging, having a high ship speed is really, really good. So I would actually consider it a plus for the ship. It also has the bomb sub-weapon. That's just really good. Gives you a ton of invulnerability. It has a fast startup. There's a lot of it you can pick up. So survival wise, this ship is very, very good, it seems. Some of the other ships might be better, but this one is very solid, and I kind of recommend playing it because it is standout and really cool. Then of course I can't neglect to mention the teleport mechanic. This is really interesting because over the years there's been a lot of discussion of shmups having teleport mechanics, and I'm sure they've appeared in other places. But this game is one of the games that really stood out to me as like, okay, they're trying to make this work in a real way. And I'm not exactly sure how to feel about the teleport mechanic, because it seems useful in a lot of places, and it could seem to be very OP and powerful if you knew how to use it correctly. But the way I ended up using it was, you don't want to get too teleport happy, but it comes in handy for a lot of situations. For example, with a lot of patterns that have really heavy overlap or that are tricky to try and dodge through, you can just teleport over them. Or if you're low on bombs and you need a sort of backup panic option, you can try to use your teleport as a panic button. Though I will say the startup on it is much slower than a bomb, so bomb's a better panic button. But if you're running low on bombs, there's still the teleport. And there's also certain sections of the game where you can tell the developers like, okay, go ahead and teleport here. That's the idea. So keep that in the back of your mind, that the teleport mechanic is very useful, but it isn't perfect. And then one last note on the mechanics is that when you go into the control setup, you will see that there's two different options for your movement. There's half speed, and then there's precise or something like that. Forget the precise one. That one is way too slow and crappy. You definitely want to map to half speed. So the way I have it set up, normally what I put my laser on when I play Dodonpachi, I have half speed mounted to there, and then when I put my rapid shot on, that's what I put just the main shot, then bomb, still bomb. So that would be my little tip, is ignore the precise movement option. That's way too slow. Go ahead and use half speed. That's much better. Even for very precise dodges, half speed I still think is a lot better, because the precise movement one is so slow that I think it's more difficult to dodge with, even if you get a very dense pattern, which the game will throw at you from time to time, which is pretty fun. So speaking of thick, dense patterns, now let's talk about the boss fights of the game. What's cool about the boss fights is there's a nice variety of what they will do. So a lot of these Toaplan style shmups tend to struggle a little bit in the boss fight department, because I think Toaplan shmups themselves struggle a bit in the boss fight department, where they're a little bit too jank and easy to manipulate, or they're a little bit too straightforward and boring at times. They're not as intricate and detailed as cave style boss fights. But this game strikes a nice middle ground where you can get kind of like the opening stage 1 boss and stage 2 boss, where they are pretty straightforward. But then as you get later and later into the game, you start running into all these sub bosses, especially the TLB and everything, that get much more intricate with the patterns that almost feel like Psycho games at times, actually. So it's really fun. The boss fights stood out to me as very well implemented, and they're fast and brutal too, so you're always on the tip of your toes, and I'm just really impressed with how intense a lot of the dodging sections and stuff are. And they have a nice pace and rhythm to them. Not too long, but not so short like Grand Cross Renovation, where they're fun but they last about 3 seconds. This felt much more balanced in that department, so that was a lot of fun. Now let's talk about the scoring system to round things out. I really enjoyed the scoring system of the game, and that's something because I'm not as into figuring out new game scoring systems, indie game scoring systems especially, where I don't really know what it is and I can't really research it all that well. This game has a tutorial, it has a cadet school to kind of give you an idea, but I'm going to try my best to give what I figured out was what I know so far. So the way it works is when you kill things, they drop chips, kind of like in Ketsui. But rather than being based on proximity, they're based on from time of death, and then they start to lose value as they hang out on screen. So it becomes a really fun meta, because at times you want to sit up at the top of the screen and point blank and just kill things right as they come on screen to get the maximum chip values and everything like that. But then as you get further and further into the game starts to pick up on this, and it starts to throw some curveballs at you, where now sitting at the top of the screen is going to get you shot in the face. So instead what you need to do is kind of need to hang back and delay the kill on things to get those chips. But the risk reward of the game is very, very well managed. One of the best managed scoring systems in an indie shmup I've seen in quite a long time, where it feels like when you're taking a risk, there's a nice juicy reward, and it's not too simple, it's not too predictable. There's always a bit of optimization that can be done. The screen is definitely moving even if you're not. So I think the scoring system was a ton of fun, and that's why I ended up getting the second place score on the leaderboard, because I just kept playing, kept wanting to improve my score. I did notice there's these sort of question mark things that spawn out of enemies. It's question mark items, and from what I can understand, they're like secret items, and the way you get them in stage 1 is that you have to speed kill these certain enemies, and when you speed kill them, you get the 3 question mark things. And then when you get to the boss, you get an upgraded version of the boss that's harder, but when you kill the boss, you get more points, and also you get a free extend at the end. And speaking of extends, I also thought this game had a very well thought out extend system that just felt amazing. So the way the extend system works is that every few or so points you get an extend, just like in Garega, but as you get further and further in the game, that requirement gets larger. So at the beginning, I can't remember what the digit is, but it basically doubles later on in the game. So you need to get double those points later on to still get that extend. And so the game has a nice sort of vibe of giving you extends, but also throwing a lot of crap at you and being dangerous and difficult. And I was sweating because I had like 3 runs up until the one that I finally got to clear, where I was this close to clearing, but some stray bullet clipped me in the final stage, and then I didn't have enough resources for the TLB and everything. And coming into the last stage, I had nice momentum, and then coming into the boss, the final boss, and then the TLB, I had just enough resources to make that work. So I think the scoring system was very well done, a lot of fun, and I can see people grinding this game for score for real. I can see players picking the game up and saying, okay, I'm going to get a high score in the game, and it would be very interesting to watch, especially in the higher difficulties. The game is very well aware of this idea of survival versus scoring and having them being a nice risk and reward. And then one final note is, because the extends are tied to your score, it's one of those nice shmups where scoring in the game, like Zero Ranger, is actually very helpful for survival because you get extends and all that sort of fun stuff. I am not sure if there's a rank system or not. It didn't really feel that powerful if there was one. I do know when you get the 3 hidden items, you get an upgraded version of the bosses, but I don't know if there's more of a rank outside of that. So overall, my final thoughts on Sophstar, I definitely recommend it. It's very well made, very well presented. The soundtrack and the sound design is rock solid. The scoring system is very fun and engaging. There's a ton of content, not only with ships, but also with all the different modes and all the different difficulty selections. There's online leaderboards, which is really important, where if you want to grind for score, now you can feel comfortable doing that competitively without having to worry too much about going to all these different websites. And I think in-game leaderboards are just the future of the genre, so shout outs to them for having those as well. And the price point is very, very fair at $10. At least that's the last time I checked. Excellent stuff. I think overall, 2 thumbs up. If you're a Toaplan fan, I don't think you can go wrong here, and I can really see it catching on with a lot of players in the future. So thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Anthony Iodice, Aaron Solis, Asa Davis, Ben, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Delta Tango 6, Disco Staslaya, DJ420 Praise It, Eric H, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Jim Knockham, Joe Angelo, John Kelly, Jolts, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, Kikoman 589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Mechalin, Michelle Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Radocat, Raul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf 015, Scanline City, Seesaw STG, 7 Overdose, Shane Sinjensky, Shmup Junkie, SLW, The Boot Rex, The Real Ikuzo, The Dirty Screech, The Old Bensta, Tirem, Sugumo, Plasmo, Twilight EX, Utakaya. Thanks so much.